I know you have a passion for words as well, which you mentioned. You have, I think, a Facebook page with words.
Yeah, yeah.
And
So I have this. I don't know. I've always been kind of intrigued by words, and I never really thought of this as being somehow related until I don't know a few years ago. It started occurring to me that actually there is a convergence here. Words and language, I think, are absolutely fascinating. We are trying to express ourselves, and maybe that's not what we're best at, particularly in software development. We're perhaps not as good as we think we are, except that we keep trying. And as time went by, I realized that when we are focused on software development, we are trying to create systems of meaning. That's what we're doing. And it was this kind of curious thing that I thought that language was quite interesting, and the concepts of language. And I don't know, words, words are okay, but they're etymologies. Every word has a history, and it's this idea of like how every word is a story. Very few words. I think the simple way is people sometimes say, "Oh no, this is not what this word means." Well, that's not how words work. Words end up meaning all kinds of things depending on the context of use. And what dawned on me over time is this idea of like, actually, that's what we're doing when we are writing code. It's not merely a set of instructions. We are actually creating a system of meaning, and we're normally doing it with other people. We're trying to collaborate on a system of meaning. So when somebody says, "Oh, that's just or that's just semantics," we have to ask ourselves, "Wait a minute, what else is there? What do you think it is that we're doing?" Early in my career, I remember working one place where we actually had a copy of the C standard, and eventually I had some involvement in the C++ standard. You kind of get into this whole question of the meaning of things. What are the semantics of this? I also had some involvement in a couple of other standards and interest in a few more. This whole question of what does this mean and how is it used here and what is the context? So it took a few years for me to figure out that it was actually the same interest. My interest in language, spoken language, natural language, is drawn or grows from the same source, if you like, and probably ends up at the same destination as my interest in some of the detail of code of like, well, hang on, what are we saying here? This is not just a name, it's not just a label. When we're struggling for something in a piece of code, struggling to name a test, what are we trying to show here? Struggling to name a class or a function, what does it represent? That's a really hard question. We're asking the hardest question, what does it mean? And it's also that these things have a history as well, and they live within a system of meaning. So for me, it ended up that what I thought of as being quite different, actually the same part of the same story. So yeah, I have this page on Facebook, Word Friday, that originally started because I remember listening one Friday to a local radio station, and they kind of posed this puzzle. They said, what is another word for synonym? Now that kind of is like, oh, synonym. That's a really interesting idea. That what is the word for, or what do what is the word that you would use for a thesaurus? Another word, or rather a synonym for thesaurus, because thesaurus is a book of synonyms. Jump and leap, you'd expect to find it. And I suddenly thought, wow, what's a synonym for? Well, I know this one. For some reason, I knew this, and it's synonymicon. And I thought, well, that's not a hard question. And I said, well, why didn't I just put this out? And it was a Friday. So I started it on Twitter, and then I pushed it Google Plus, and then eventually it became a page on Facebook. And I put a lot of other language stuff there. These days I don't post a Friday word as often on Word Friday, so it still retains the name. There you go. There's a history there. But on all the other days of the week, stuff I read to do with languages, sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's deep, sometimes it's political, sometimes it's historical, to do with words and language. I post that. So I keep running that. I still find that to be interesting. So maybe I'm an amateur linguist, but I'm certainly not. I don't have the kind of credentials to be a proper linguist, but I find it fun. And there are people out there who also kind of find it fun. So yeah, that's where I go with that.
Yeah, I've been talking to people before on this channel about these things that I like to write, and I feel that writing has helped me become a better programmer. Like better writing and better programming seems to be connected in some way. And that's why I'm also always curious of asking people who share this passion for words and language and Do you think this happens? And if you think this happens, do you have any idea why this would happen?
I think this happens. I think you're right. Because for me, I know that I I started writing articles quite a long time ago. In fact, it was very specifically I was part of the reason I was really upset with the job that I had. I didn't enjoy it. I remember just going into work and feeling miserable. And well, I wanted to do something that was actually kind of allowed me to kind of like, well, one, say yes, I do know something about software, and two, try and just try and express that, because there's some fun here. There's enjoyment to be had in learning this stuff and putting ideas together. And so I started writing articles, and I don't think I'd ever thought of myself as being. I think I had a mental image from school that I wasn't good at writing and things like that. But over the years, I just started writing more and more and more for user groups, for things that got published in the computing press in the UK, and then articles, and then I had columns, and it kind of built up from there. And the writing, if I look back over time, the writing got better. But also, I found that what we were trying to do there is a very similar thing. We are trying to learn to express ourselves. We are trying to say, well, what do we actually mean? What do I want to say here? What concept is this? And of course, in one sense, programming is a very different kind of thing. It uses a formal notation set, and there's a different flow to the ideas of writing an article, or a book, or a paper. But at the same time, they share something deep, which is ultimately, what are we trying to say? How do we say it? How do I get a thought from this head into somebody else's head? How do I communicate that? And this, and it's exactly as you say. The more you do it, the better you get at it. What you're learning to do is to express yourself, organize your thoughts. Programming is all about organizing our thoughts. Every paradigm we work with is a system of organization of our thoughts. This is thought stuff. So that's why I think there is a connection. And I actually eventually took that into writing. I write short fiction every now and then, and that was a really interesting departure. It's something I kind of thought I wanted to do when I was younger, but actually it was trying that, learning a new thing. Because you might say, well, yeah, sure, you can write some English, but writing a story has different mechanics. Again, it shares something, but it's different again. And again, more practice. When you start paying attention, you start getting better. And I think my code and my other writing improved, my presentations improved, everything improves, because all you're trying to do is the heart. It's this idea of like, what are we trying to say, and how do we communicate it so somebody else can go, oh, I understand, or I understand but disagree, or I understand but have you thought of this, or they're able to add something to it. So I think that is, there's a deep idea there. But I think this year was quite interesting for reasons other than the obvious. I came across two pieces of research in the science and psychology press that actually demonstrated a similarity between, or a common core, if you like, to people who are good at linguistics or have an interest in linguistics and programming. It turns out that the common core is not, are you a mathematician? The traditional one is, if you're a mathematician, you're right. You're suitable for programming. That's the kind of the 1960s, 1970s way of looking at things. And with no disrespect to all the mathematicians out there, and this is somebody who qualified doing physics, so I obviously clearly need to be careful what I'm saying here. But no disrespect to mathematicians out there, but honestly, mathematicians don't write code that much better than anybody else. Sometimes it's possibly worse, because they think that they can do it without practice. They don't recognize that there's a whole separate discipline. It's not a sub-discipline of maths. It's actually a separate discipline in which maths may inform it and play a role. But actually, it shares more in common with linguistics. The people who are thinking about programming problems, kind of like put them into an MRI, watch their brain light up. It's just like, hey, that's like they're thinking language, not like they're thinking mathematics. So that for me was an interesting one, because often people say, well, programming language. This is a discussion I saw last year on Twitter. It was, is programming language, is that a valid metaphor? Should we be thinking of it as languages? And I'm absolutely. They are clearly different languages. They are different systems, but they have a lot more in common than they don't. And it turns out that actually there is some truth to that, it seems.
Yeah, I remember that I was very good at grammar in school, and that was, I think,
Yeah.
part of. And then I learned that, the grammar that we were learning was fundamentally the structured grammar created by Noam Chomsky, or discovered, which is
Yeah,
fundamentally
you've got
the same theory that led to compilers and.
Yeah, exactly. This is the thing, is I actually read some of Chomsky's work, and although the question of a universal grammar is an unresolved question, it's a nice theory, but it's not necessarily, and it's actually quite difficult to understand how it might have come about through evolution, and there are a number of questions about it. But as a lens for understanding something, rather than it being like a theory of physics or something like that, it's a really interesting way of looking at the world, and it has given us, all the regular expressions, context-free grammars, all of that. Yep, that's all Chomsky. And so, like you, it was this kind of realization, wait a minute, I know this, but it's from a different source. It's from programming, and actually this is where these things came from. So yeah, I think there's more deep connection. The more you look, the more you see that you can learn something in one domain and transfer it to another.
And another thing that I noticed is I started using more and more a thesaurus when I'm trying to find names in my code. And this actually leads to more precise naming, to better names, and so on. There's a connection there between the things that you learn and actually.
I think
please.
Sorry, I think there's a point there about using. I think there's a really important point there about being comfortable looking up something. So actually, I think one of the most important things to learning is admitting that you don't know something, or rather, there might be a better way to do this, and then going to something else. And it's not necessarily always that the thesaurus will give you the answer, but it will cause you to think. It will make you ask questions perhaps you wouldn't have asked before. And you go, well, actually, these words are not the words I need. But now I'm looking at them, I understand why. I understand better what it is that I need. It's not these, but it is something else. But it gets you thinking. It's an empirical activity. You're investigating, and you're trying to find a solution. And I think that's very powerful. I think it's not something we acknowledge as much. I think